In the grand marble lobby of Evergreen Financial's flagship branch, an air of arrogance and dismissal hung heavily as Ellen Carter, the branch manager, regarded Veronica Green with a look of sheer condescension. As the tall, poised black woman approached the counter to make a large withdrawal, Ellen's voice dripped with disdain. "I'm sorry, but we can't just hand out cash to anyone who walks in," she said, pushing the withdrawal slip back across the counter. "Especially not amounts like this." The words echoed throughout the bank, drawing the attention of nearby employees, who quickly formed a small circle around Veronica, their eyes scanning her with a mixture of judgment and curiosity. A younger staff member leaned in to whisper to a colleague, "Yeah, right. She doesn't even look like she has that kind of money," followed by the snickering laughter of a few others. Veronica, standing tall, shoulders squared, and face calm despite the humiliation, remained silent. She refused to let the sting of their words touch her. They assumed she didn't belong, that she couldn't possibly afford the $150,000 she was attempting to withdraw. The discomfort in the air was palpable, and the tension mounted as the staff exchanged knowing glances, clearly convinced that someone like her was out of place in their high-end establishment. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly know, was that this woman, who they looked down upon so easily, was Veronica Green, the CEO of Evergreen Financial, someone who had fought her entire life to rise to the ranks from a lowly teller to the very top. The sense of entitlement in the room was thick, but Veronica remained composed. Little did they know, they were about to make a mistake that would change everything about them, their careers, and the entire institution. Veronica Green's journey from a humble teller trainee to the CEO of Evergreen Financial had not been an easy one. Raised in a modest neighborhood with no wealth or connections, she had relied on grit, intelligence, and an unshakable work ethic to push through the countless barriers she encountered. At the age of 50, Veronica stood as an embodiment of perseverance. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a leader, a pioneer. But her path had been anything but ordinary. 25 years earlier, Veronica had stood at a different counter, her name tag reading Teller Trainee. She had no idea then that one day she would be standing at the helm of one of the nation's most prestigious financial institutions. It had taken more than just academic credentials to climb the corporate ladder. Veronica earned her MBA from Yale, while working long hours at Evergreen Financial, building a reputation not just as a skilled banker, but as a problem solver who could turn around failing branches and revitalize struggling divisions. From teller to loan officer, branch manager to regional director, she excelled in every role. And every time someone tried to underestimate her, she proved them wrong. Her rise to the top wasn't without its struggles. Many people doubted her, not because of her qualifications, but because of the color of her skin. As she made her way up the corporate ladder, she encountered silent prejudices and subtle barriers at every turn. Yet, each time, she persevered, moving forward with the quiet strength of someone who knew what it took to earn her place, and more importantly, what it meant to pave the way for others. When she became the CEO of Evergreen Financial at 48, Veronica had shattered the glass ceiling. She was the first black woman to lead the institution, and the decision was met with mixed reactions. While her qualifications were undeniable, her record-breaking successes, her tireless leadership, and her impeccable credentials, some board members expressed concerns in private meetings. These concerns, however, had little to do with her ability or vision. Instead, they questioned whether their high-profile clients would be comfortable with her black skin representing the face of the company. The thought stung. But Veronica didn't let it stop her. She had already proven time and time again that she was capable, and now, as CEO, she would make sure the company followed her lead, striving for excellence and fairness at every level. Yet, even as she stood at the pinnacle of her career, Veronica had not forgotten the struggles that many minority customers face within the company. Despite her own success, she had witnessed troubling trends, complaints about poor service, about being treated unfairly, especially among people of color. She could no longer ignore the truth buried beneath the glossy reports. She decided to act. The undercover boss approach wasn't just a gimmick for her. It was necessary. It was time to see for herself how her customers were being treated, especially at the bank's flagship branch, which had a reputation for customer service. The branch was managed by Ellen Carter, a 15-year veteran whose impressive numbers masked a deeper problem. While the branch boasted high transaction volumes and new accounts, the customer exit interviews told a different story. People were leaving, particularly customers of color, citing poor service and feeling unwelcome. It was clear that there was a deep divide between what the bank's report showed and what was really happening behind closed doors. So, Veronica walked through the revolving doors of Evergreen Financial's flagship branch one Tuesday morning, disguised in a simple navy hoodie, dark slacks, and a face cap. She chose modest attire, purposely blending into the background as a regular customer. What she witnessed during her brief 15-minute observation was enough to confirm her worst fears. Systemic discrimination was alive and well in the heart of her institution. She watched as a white businessman was greeted warmly and escorted immediately to a desk, bypassing the line completely. An elderly Asian couple was shown no such courtesy. They were directed to wait with no smile, no warmth. A young white woman's transaction was completed in under 2 minutes, while a Hispanic man in janitor work clothes was scrutinized, made to provide multiple forms of ID, and forced to wait for nearly 10 minutes. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Veronica's heart sank as she saw the disparity in how different races were treated. This wasn't just bad customer service. It was bias. And it was the very thing she had worked so hard to dismantle throughout her career. As she watched the unfair treatment unfold, Veronica made a decision. The time for silent observation was over. She was going to confront the issue head-on. Little did the employees know the woman they had judged and humiliated was their CEO, someone who had fought tooth and nail to get where she was. And now, she was ready to make sure the company would finally stand for the values it claimed to uphold. Veronica Green had seen enough. The familiar sting of systemic bias had settled deep within her as she quietly observed the staff's behavior towards minority customers. The contrast between the white businessman who breezed through the doors and was immediately welcomed with a smile and the elderly Asian couple who were barely acknowledged was too stark to ignore. She had witnessed it all. The snide looks, the dismissive attitudes, the microaggressions woven into the fabric of daily operations at the flagship branch of Evergreen Financial. As a CEO, Veronica knew the importance of customer service, but more than that, she understood the power of perception. What she was seeing now was not just bad customer service. It was a deep-rooted problem, one that was far more insidious than anyone had imagined. The staff behind the counters moved like clockwork, efficiency masking the biases beneath their well-rehearsed smiles. As a young white woman made her deposit with casual ease, a Hispanic man in janitor's clothes approached the same counter. The change in tone was immediate. The teller's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by suspicion, as though he were asking for something more than a simple transaction. Veronica could feel the tension in the air thickening, her stomach turning as the man's dignity was slowly drained, piece by piece, with every question, every sideways glance from the teller. His check cashing request was treated as a threat to the bank's security, and the transaction took nearly 10 minutes, a far cry from the 2 minutes it had taken the previous customer. But the real turning point came when Veronica herself approached the counter. After waiting for over 30 minutes, despite 3 white customers arriving after her and being served before she was, the humiliation had reached its peak. She knew exactly what was coming. She was next in line, but her presence was overlooked as a teller. Beth moved on to other customers, offering a smile and polite conversation. When Veronica finally reached the window, the coldness was palpable. Beth's smile faltered. The warmth that had been so freely given to the previous customers seemed to evaporate as she greeted Veronica with a clipped, almost dismissive tone. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," Veronica said, sliding the withdrawal slip and her ID across the counter. When Beth saw the amount, $150,000, her eyes widened and Veronica noticed the immediate change in her demeanor. Beth's voice rose slightly, just enough for the other staff members to hear. "This is a large amount," she said, a tinge of disbelief hanging in the air. The implication was clear. Veronica wasn't supposed to have this kind of money. There was no way someone who looked like her could afford it. No way that a black woman, wearing a simple navy hoodie and dark slacks, could walk into this prestigious bank and request such an amount. The judgment hung heavily in the air as Mark, the senior teller, came over to help. His approach was deliberate. His towering presence felt like an effort to intimidate. But Veronica refused a flinch. The more Mark scrutinized her ID and the document she presented, the clearer it became. He wasn't just verifying the transaction. He was questioning her legitimacy. "We've been seeing some unusual activity on these types of accounts lately," Mark said, his voice louder than necessary. The phrase "these types" hung in the air, dripping with insinuation. Veronica knew exactly what he meant. It was the old, ugly stereotype. A black woman couldn't possibly be a legitimate, high-level client. "I understand the need for security," Veronica said evenly, her voice calm but firm. "But I provided my identification and bank card. I've been a customer of this bank for years, and I would like to complete my transaction now." But the humiliation didn't end there. No, it only deepened as Richard, another staff member, leaned in and whispered something to Mark that was clearly audible to anyone nearby. "Probably one of those money laundering or check cashing schemes," he muttered, his disdain for Veronica clear. The way they spoke about her, as if she weren't even worthy of basic respect, was a slap in the face. But Veronica stood tall, determined to show them her composure, not allowing the venom to break her. Veronica's hands clenched briefly, but she held her ground, unwilling to let them see how deeply their words stung. Her gaze never wavered. She was a leader, someone who had fought to rise to the top in a world that told her she didn't belong. She had proven herself every single day, and she would not be reduced to the stereotypes they so easily imposed on her. "I'd like to speak with someone who can actually help me complete my transaction," Veronica said, her voice steady. "Someone with the authority to override whatever concerns you seem to have." It was then that Ellen Carter, the branch manager, appeared. Her confident stride was unmistakable, a practiced blend of faux concern and force authority. She didn't bother to introduce herself or even ask for Veronica's name. She assumed the role of gatekeeper, of someone who had the power to decide who was worthy of service and who wasn't. "I understand there's some confusion about your withdrawal request," Ellen said, her voice dripping with condescension. Veronica's patience was wearing thin, but she didn't let it show. "There's no confusion on my part," she replied, her tone unwavering. "I'm simply trying to access my own money." Ellen's response was nothing short of insulting. "This amount doesn't seem appropriate for someone like you. This bank prides itself on dignity, and we have a class of customers we serve. So we can't serve you here." The words struck like a physical blow. They were a declaration of everything she had worked against her entire career. It was no longer about her qualifications or her professionalism. It was about her skin color, her presence in a space that they believed she didn't belong in. Ellen's words revealed the ugly truth. This wasn't about security protocols. This was about prejudice. Veronica's chest tightened. She had heard these words before, felt the sting before, but now she was ready. She wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. As Ellen Carter's words hung in the air, it was clear that Veronica Green's calm, dignified response had no place in the narrative Ellen had written for her. Veronica knew the weight of every word and gesture, the judgment in her eyes, the implicit understanding that someone like her, someone black, didn't belong in this space, wasn't worthy of their service. The insinuation was not just offensive, it was crushing. Ellen's tone was a calculated mix of authority and condescension as she dismissed Veronica's right to withdraw her own money, implying that it simply didn't seem appropriate for a woman like her. Veronica, having fought her entire career against the toxic stereotypes placed upon her, wasn't about to let these employees define her worth. But in that moment, Veronica knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every single person who had been treated with the same contempt, who had been silently subjected to these biases and prejudices. The elderly black man sitting at the back of the bank, the Hispanic woman who had quietly left without making a scene, the countless others who had walked out feeling humiliated but never having the courage to speak up. Veronica was about to speak for them. The branch's staff exchanged knowing glances behind Ellen's back, a collective understanding of what was happening. Mark, the senior teller, snickered, his casual mockery betraying the ease with which the bank's employees had settled into their racial biases. Richard, standing beside him, practically gleamed with the smug satisfaction of having found a target to ridicule, adding fuel to the fire with his comment about money laundering. They were playing a game, and in their minds, Veronica was just another pawn, a black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, trying to break rules they never thought she should be able to challenge. But Veronica wasn't just a pawn. She was their CEO. She had worked tirelessly to climb to the top. And though they couldn't see it yet, her composure, her quiet strength, was about to change everything. Veronica, with an internal calm that surprised even herself, stood her ground. The humiliation she was enduring was not just personal. It was a reflection of the systemic racism that had been allowed to fester in her institution. But she wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let them reduce her to a stereotype. With a clear, steady voice, she looked at Ellen, her gaze unflinching. "I understand a need for security," Veronica said, her tone professional, but now carrying a quiet authority that no one could ignore. "I provided all the identification you need. I've been a customer of this bank for years. I've worked here for decades. I'm simply trying to access my own money." It was then that the staff truly began to realize the magnitude of their mistake. Veronica was not just a customer. She was their CEO. Their disbelief was palpable. The weight of their actions, their unspoken biases, began to settle in the room like a suffocating cloud. The humiliation they had projected onto her was beginning to flip back onto them. Ellen's eyes darted nervously between Veronica and the staff around her. The veneer of professionalism that she had clung to so tightly was now cracking, revealing her own discomfort, her own realization that something was terribly wrong. But even now, despite the weight of her growing fear, Ellen tried to keep her composure. She leaned in, lowering her voice in what she surely thought would be a final attempt to regain control. "Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable going to a check-cashing place down the street," she suggested, her words dripping with contempt. "They're more accustomed to handling people like you." The audacity of the statement stunned Veronica for only a moment before she found her voice again. Ellen's dismissal was a blatant, calculated move, one that had worked countless times before. But it wouldn't work now. Not this time. Veronica reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the leather bag her team had gifted her when she was promoted to Chief Operations Officer. She pulled out her phone, and as she did, her gaze briefly flickered toward the security cameras positioned around the lobby. She knew she was being watched. She knew this moment would be captured, preserved for posterity. But it wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been wronged by this system. "I'll need to make a call," Veronica said coolly, stepping back slightly from the counter, still remaining in full view of the entire bank. As she dialed, the tension in the air reached a boiling point. The staff waited, uncertain of what would come next. Richard and Mark exchanged looks, a mixture of surprise and smugness, unable to comprehend the gravity of the situation they had just helped escalate. "Diane," Veronica said, her voice now more professional, more certain than ever, "I need you at the downtown branch. Now." At the sound of that name, Ellen's face fell. The realization hit her like a cold splash of water. Diane Porter, the head of operations, the woman whose very name struck terror in the hearts of those who crossed the line. Veronica had her direct number. The connection was instant, and Ellen's world began to unravel. What had started as a calculated power play had now become her greatest mistake. In the silence that followed, Veronica's calm demeanor remained a sharp contrast to the chaos that was about to unfold. She wasn't just going to let them get away with it. Not today. The air in the bank seemed to freeze as Veronica Green calmly dialed a number, each ring echoing like a countdown to the inevitable. The quiet murmur of employees, customers, and machines faded into the background, replaced by the sharpness of Veronica's measured voice. As she spoke, a sense of calm authority emanated from her, unshakable and steady. Diane Porter, the head of operations at Evergreen Financial, was the one person who could clear this up, the one person who could cut through the chaos. When Veronica uttered Diane's name, it was a signal, not just a call for help, but a declaration. This wasn't a woman who had to ask for permission or wait for someone else to fix what was wrong. She was in control, and her call would set everything in motion. Her calm, professional tone betrayed none of the fury she must have felt. She had risen above those emotions. She wasn't angry. She wasn't frustrated. She was simply doing what needed to be done. She was about to end the charade. As the phone rang, Veronica's eyes never left Ellen Carter. Ellen stood there, shifting her weight from one foot to another, trying to keep up her confident demeanor. But the truth was, her composure was crumbling piece by piece. Veronica could see it in the way Ellen's eyes flickered nervously between her and the staff around her. The facade was slipping. Ellen had made a monumental error by underestimating the woman in front of her. But the game was far from over. Diane, Veronica spoke clearly. I need you in the downtown branch right now. The situation is escalating. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by the unmistakable sound of Diane Porter snapping into action. Diane had been with Evergreen for nearly as long as Veronica had. They had fought battles together, broken glass ceilings together, and navigated the treacherous waters of corporate finance as women of color. Diane knew exactly what this meant. She didn't need an explanation. The urgency in Veronica's voice was enough. Meanwhile, Ellen tried to regain control of the situation, her voice strained, attempting to maintain some semblance of authority. Ma'am, you need to leave the premises immediately. You're causing a disturbance, she said, trying to dismiss Veronica as if she were just another customer trying to make trouble. But Veronica didn't flinch. Not an inch. Her gaze remained fixed, unwavering. There was no rush in her response, just a quiet strength that made Ellen's words feel like empty threats. Ellen's confidence had started to crack, and the unease in her eyes was beginning to spread to the rest of the staff. Mark, who had been standing by with arms crossed, suddenly looked uncomfortable. His smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by a visible tension in his shoulders. Richard, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier taunts now fading into the realization that this was no longer about Veronica. It was about something much bigger. The truth was staring them in the face. At that moment, a low hum filled the air as the security camera footage began to make its way to Diane Porter's desk. The bank security system was always watching, but today it was more than just monitoring. It was a silent witness to the injustice unfolding in front of them. Every interaction, every subtle display of bias, every uncomfortable pause between transactions was captured, logged, and documented. What had started as an isolated incident was now becoming part of a larger, undeniable pattern. Diane, Veronica said, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. We've got every customer interaction from a morning saved in the system. You need to see this. It's all on tape. This isn't just about me. This is about how this branch has treated people for years. At that moment, the weight of the situation began to settle heavily on Ellen Carter. Her mind raced, her confidence now fully shattered. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. She had made a judgment call based solely on Veronica's skin color. And in doing so, she had triggered something much larger than she could control. The realization hit her hard. She had just publicly humiliated the CEO of the company. And the worst part? She hadn't even recognized her. The bank lobby, which had been buzzing with the usual hum of transactions and small talk, now felt eerily quiet. Ellen's words hung in the air like a dense fog. Customers around the room exchanged uncomfortable glances, some avoiding eye contact, others staring openly, watching this dramatic turn of events unfold. Even the security guard, Thomas, who had been standing by nervously, now found himself caught in the crossfire of something far more morally complex than he had signed up for. I'm going to have to ask you to leave now, Ellen said again, her voice rising slightly, but it was clear that her attempt to regain control had failed. The weight of her mistake was now impossible to ignore. Veronica stood tall, every inch of her posture radiating authority. She hadn't flinched when Ellen tried to diminish her. She hadn't reacted when Mark and Richard mocked her. She didn't need to shout or get angry. All she had to do was call in the right person. She had done that, and now Ellen knew exactly who she was up against. And just as Ellen began to signal for security, the doors of the bank burst open with force that stopped everyone in their tracks. Diane Porter, tall and composed as ever, entered the lobby. Her presence commanded instant attention. The room, still tense from the earlier confrontation, seemed to breathe in sync with her arrival. Diane's sharp gaze swept across the staff, landing on Ellen, then settling on Veronica, who was still standing unfazed at the center of it all. "Stop this immediately," Diane's voice rang out. "Now." The room seemed to shrink as Diane Porter's presence filled the space. The once bustling, marble-floored lobby of Evergreen Financial now stood in stunned silence, every pair of eyes trained on Diane, whose every movement conveyed the absolute authority that she carried as the head of operations. Veronica had barely flinched when Ellen Carter tried to belittle her, nor had she faltered when the staff had exchanged mocking glances behind her back. But now, with Diane entering the scene, a palpable shift occurred. Ellen's facade of confidence cracked completely. The cold, calculating smugness that had been so apparent in Ellen's earlier behavior disappeared in an instant. As Diane walked toward Veronica, the room felt heavier with the realization that the person who had just publicly humiliated Veronica was about to face the consequences of her actions. The contrast between Ellen's nervousness and Diane's composed intensity could not have been starker. It was as though the ground beneath Ellen was slipping away from her, and she was unable to catch her balance. "Stop this immediately," Diane commanded, her voice like ice cutting through the tense silence that had gripped the lobby. She was not asking. She was telling. There was no question of compliance. There was no room for defiance. Diane's very presence screamed authority, and Ellen, despite her years of experience, seemed like a child who had just been caught in the act. Her eyes flitted nervously toward the staff, who now looked like they regretted their involvement in the spectacle that had been unfolding. The smirks, the mocking glances, the assumptions, it was all unraveling before them. Diane turned sharply to face Ellen, her eyes flashing with fury. She didn't need to say much. Her very gaze spoke volumes. Ellen could see it now, the wrath she had unwittingly summoned. It wasn't just about a botched transaction. This was about Ellen and the entire team's failure to uphold the values of fairness and equality that they claimed to champion. The actions of Ellen and the staff were not just an oversight. They were an attack on everything Evergreen Financial had pretended to stand for. Veronica had stood strong, unshaken by the attempts to belittle her, but now it was Diane who was delivering the crushing blow. Diane stepped forward, her tone as calm and measured as ever, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of fury. "Ellen, do you know who you're speaking to?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but heavy with implication. Ellen stood frozen, her face slowly draining of color as the weight of Diane's words hit her. Veronica, meanwhile, stood to the side, her eyes focused on the unfolding scene, her hands still clasped in front of her. She felt no need to intervene, for Diane was taking control. The knowledge that this moment was about to change everything, that the way Ellen had treated her and countless others like her was about to come to a definitive end, flooded through her. She had been ready for this, prepared for the long battle that would be required to root out the discrimination in her company. But now, in this moment, Diane was stepping in to fight this battle for her. Ellen opened her mouth, but no words came out. The realization was dawning on her too late. She had crossed a line, one she could never uncross, and the repercussions were about to come down like an avalanche. "Your actions today have not only violated company policies," Diane continued, now addressing staff as a whole, her eyes never leaving Ellen. "They have violated every standard of decency and fairness we claim to uphold here. Veronica Green is not just another customer. She is your CEO. You have failed her. You have failed every single customer who has walked through these doors seeking fairness, respect, and dignity." At those words, a few of the staff members visibly shifted, their discomfort growing. Mark looked away, his face pale as Diane's gaze landed on him. He had been so quick to mock, so eager to follow Ellen's lead. But now, the realization of what had been a part of sank in. Richard, standing nearby, shifted uneasily, trying to hide the guilt that was now so apparent on his face. The room had gone silent once again, the full weight of the moment sinking in. Diane turned to the security cameras mounted above, knowing that the evidence was clear. "Every interaction today has been recorded," she said, her voice cold and final. "We have seen it all. The bias, the discrimination, the treatment of customers based on the color of their skin. This is no longer about what happened in this branch today. It's about what has been happening for years. Ellen flinched as Diane's words landed like a punch to the gut. The humiliation, the shame of being exposed, was impossible to ignore. She had thought she could get away with it, that her power and position would protect her. But now, standing in front of the woman she had just insulted, Ellen realized the full scope of her mistake. She had misjudged Veronica Green in the most humiliating and public way possible. In a final act of resolution, Diane turned to face the other employees, addressing them with a steely gaze. Your actions today have not just cost you your jobs. They've cost you your integrity. Ellen, Mark, Richard, you are all terminated, effective immediately. The shock rippled through the staff. No one dared speak. No one dared move. The consequences of their actions were unfolding in real time, and they were brutal. Ellen's face twisted in disbelief as she realized she was being escorted out. The power she had taken for granted had evaporated, leaving nothing but the bitter sting of failure. Diane watched as the disgraced employees were led away. Their heads hung low. Then she turned to Veronica, her gaze softening for the first time. "It's over," she said quietly, her voice full of respect. And in that moment, Veronica knew Evergreen Financial would never be the same again. The room was thick with tension as Ellen Carter and her team stood on the brink of the inevitable. Veronica Green's composed demeanor and Diane Porter's unwavering authority had shifted the balance in an instant, and now, as the gravity of the moment began to settle over the room, the staff felt the weight of their actions crushing them. Diane had laid down the law, but the fallout from their actions had only just begun. As Ellen was escorted out of the bank, the remaining employees, Mark, Richard, and Beth, couldn't escape the suffocating silence that followed. The entire bank seemed to hold its breath, the echoes of their mistakes reverberating through the marble halls. Ellen had once held the power in this space, but now, she was nothing more than a disgraced former manager, her authority stripped away in front of the very people who had once looked to her for guidance. But as Ellen and her colleagues were led toward the back offices to collect their personal belongings, it was clear that Veronica Green had no intention of letting this moment be a fleeting one. The humiliation that Ellen had subjected her had exposed something far deeper, a systemic rot that went far beyond the actions of a few individuals. This was about the culture that allowed Ellen's prejudiced behavior to flourish in the first place. This was about the culture that had created an environment where discrimination was not just tolerated, but silently supported. Diane had done her part. She had intervened decisively, ending the immediate threat. But now, the true work of dismantling the toxic atmosphere that had allowed Ellen and the others to thrive was about to begin. Veronica stood still at the center of the lobby, her gaze unwavering as she surveyed the aftermath of the confrontation. Ellen, Mark, and Richard were gone, but the staff and customers in the bank still remained. Their eyes were glued to her, waiting for something, anything, that would signal what came next. It was almost as if the bank was holding its collective breath, caught between the past and an uncertain future. The weight of the change was palpable. This was no longer just about the mistreatment of one woman. This was about setting a new standard, one that would ripple through the entire organization. Veronica's voice cut through the silence, her words measured but full of resolve. "What happened today isn't just about 3 people making poor choices," she began, her eyes sweeping over the remaining employees who had been standing frozen behind their counters. "It's about a culture that allowed those choices to seem acceptable. A culture that has been rotting from the inside for far too long." The employees flinched at her words. Beth, who had been visibly uncomfortable from the beginning, shifted nervously at the edge of the group, clearly expecting to be next. She had been complicit, even if only by her silence, in allowing this toxic environment to persist. But Veronica saw something in her, something that had not gone unnoticed during the confrontation. Beth wasn't like the others. She had hesitated. She had shown discomfort when her colleagues mocked and humiliated Veronica, even if she hadn't spoken up at the time. "Beth." Veronica's voice softened as she looked directly at the young woman. "I saw what you did today. I saw your discomfort, your hesitation, and I know you felt trapped in that moment." Beth's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, nodding in silent acknowledgement. She had seen the injustice, but had been too afraid to speak out. And now, She found herself caught in the aftermath of a decision she had not made, a system she had been unwilling to challenge. Veronica stepped forward, her gaze steady as she approached Beth. "I'm not going to fire you, Beth," Veronica said, her voice firm but not unkind. "In fact, I'm going to promote you. Effective immediately, you are the interim branch manager." The words hung in the air like a shockwave, and the room seemed to hold its breath once more. Beth stared at Veronica, wide-eyed, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. She had expected to be punished for her passive complicity, but what she didn't expect was the opportunity to rise above it, to prove that change was not just about pointing out flaws, but about providing the tools to fix them. "I know it's not easy to stand up to authority, especially when it's the very people who are supposed to guide you," Veronica continued. "But you've shown me that you have the potential to lead. You've seen firsthand how things can go wrong, and now you'll have the power to make them right." Tears welled up in Beth's eyes, and she nodded quickly, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I'll do my best. I won't let you down." For the first time in what had likely been a long, uncomfortable day for the rest of the staff, there was a moment of clarity. Veronica's decision wasn't just about rewarding Beth for being uncomfortable. It was about investing in a future where people didn't have to choose between standing up for what was right and keeping their job. It was about building a new culture, a culture that celebrated integrity, fairness, and respect. Diane's eyes softened as she watched the exchange between Veronica and Beth, knowing that this was just the beginning of the changes that would ripple out from this moment. The real work was about to begin. As Veronica turned back to the rest of the staff, she addressed them with the same steady resolve. "We are going to transform this culture, starting now." And just like that, the transformation began. Veronica had not only reclaimed her dignity that day, she had set in motion the beginning of a new era for Evergreen Financial, one where fairness and respect were not just corporate slogans, but lived realities for every customer who walked through the door. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as Veronica Green stood before the assembled employees, her words still echoing in the silence that followed. The firing of Ellen Carter, Mark, and Richard was a seismic event, but it wasn't enough. Veronica knew that firing a few individuals was only a small victory in the larger battle against the systemic racism that had been allowed to flourish within her company for far too long. She couldn't let this moment pass without ensuring that something more lasting, more transformative, would come from it. The culture of Evergreen Financial needed to change, and it had to start today. The staff, still processing what had just unfolded before them, stood frozen behind their counters. It was as if the realization of what had just happened hadn't fully hit them yet, and Veronica watched them carefully, her eyes scanning each one. Beth, the young teller who had shown discomfort during the confrontation, stood at the edge of the group, her hands trembling. She had been complicit in silence, but unlike the others, she had not reveled in the mockery and disrespect that had been heaped upon Veronica. Veronica knew that Beth had potential, even if she hadn't yet recognized it herself. "Beth," Veronica called, her voice steady, commanding attention. The room went quiet, and all eyes turned toward the young woman, who looked up in surprise, her face flushed with uncertainty. She had no idea what was coming. "Today, you've seen what happens when we allow things like this to go unchecked," Veronica continued. "The behavior we've witnessed today is not just about the individuals who are gone. It's about a culture that allowed them to act the way they did. It's about a culture that has allowed discrimination to go unchallenged for too long. And that culture starts with leadership." The word struck deep. Veronica's voice carried the weight of years of hard work, of leadership, and of experience. It wasn't just a lecture, it was a reckoning. Beth swallowed hard, the realization of what was happening dawning on her. She had never expected anything like this. She had expected to be reprimanded, perhaps even fired, but instead, Veronica was giving her something far more valuable, a chance to lead. "Beth," Veronica said again, her tone softening, "I'm promoting you to interim branch manager, effective immediately." The room fell silent. Beth's eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't process what she'd just heard. Her hands were shaking as she took a step forward, her voice barely audible as she said, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Veronica replied with a small, understanding smile. "I saw what you did today, Beth. You didn't join in the mocking. You didn't take pleasure in their humiliation. You stood there uncomfortable, but you didn't condone their actions. That means something. You've shown me that you have the potential to lead this branch, to turn things around. You have the ability to help make this place what it should have always been, a place of fairness and respect. Tears welled up in Beth's eyes, and she nodded, a lump in her throat preventing her from speaking. The shock was slowly turning into something else, something that felt like hope. Beth had never imagined that she, someone who had been silent in the face of injustice, would ever have the chance to be a force for change. But here she was, standing in front of Veronica, about to take on a responsibility that would change the course of her life and the lives of the people she worked with. Veronica turned to address the rest of the staff, her gaze unwavering. "This is just a beginning," she said. "Today we set a new standard. This is not a one-time act of change. This is the beginning of a transformation that will echo through this entire institution. Every one of you will be held to a new standard, one where respect and fairness are not optional. They are mandatory. Every branch, every department, every role will be evaluated, not just on profitability, but on equitable service." She let the words sink in. The staff stood in rapt attention, many of them unable to meet her eyes, others nodding with a sense of shame, perhaps recognizing the truth in what she was saying. They had been part of the problem. They had allowed things to continue unchecked, and now the reckoning had come. It wasn't just about firing a few people. It was about the change that was required, the overhaul of a toxic culture that had permeated every corner of Evergreen Financial. From this moment forward, we will no longer tolerate discrimination in any form, Veronica continued, her voice firm. We will measure success not just by our financial performance, but by how well we treat our customers, regardless of their race, background, or appearance. This is about doing what's right, not just what's easy. Diane Porter stood off to the side, watching the proceedings with a mixture of pride and determination. She had seen the shift happening in Veronica, the determination to make real change, and she knew that Veronica was the leader who could make it happen. The moment of reckoning had passed, but the real work was just beginning. Diane was already on her tablet, beginning the next steps. Immediate audits of every branch, a comprehensive review of the bank's policies, and the development of new training programs focused on inclusion and respect. Veronica turned back to Beth, her voice softer now. "You're not alone in this. You'll have the full support of this team as you transition into your new role. This is an opportunity to build something better here, and I'm counting on you." And with that, Beth found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes full of emotion. She had never felt this empowered in her life. She wasn't just taking on a role. She was becoming part of something bigger, something important, something that would change the culture of Evergreen Financial forever. Veronica nodded, then turned to the rest of the staff. "This isn't just about Beth. This is about all of us. We all have a responsibility to make this place better, to lead with integrity, to be the change that we want to see in the world." The transformation of Evergreen Financial had begun, and for the first time in a long time, Veronica felt the weight of that responsibility settle not as a burden, but as a promise. A promise that no one would ever be judged by the color of their skin, their appearance, or their background again. The work ahead would be hard, but it was a journey she was ready to take, and she knew that with the right people by her side, they would succeed. 6 months had passed since Veronica Green had first walked into the flagship branch of Evergreen Financial, undercover and unaware that the incident she had unknowingly sparked would set the stage for one of the most significant cultural shifts in the company's history. The employees who had mocked and humiliated her that day were long gone, but Veronica knew that the real work, the work of rebuilding trust, of rooting out the toxic behaviors that had festered within the walls of the institution, was far from over. The success of the equitable banking initiative she had announced in the wake of the scandal had sparked some positive changes, but Veronica was no fool. She knew that it wasn't enough to simply announce new policies, to promise the world. Change needed to be seen. It needed to be real. It needed to be experienced by the people who walked through the doors of Evergreen Financial, and it needed to be felt at every level of the company. That was why, after months of planning, Veronica had decided to take a different approach. She would go back into the branches, not as the CEO, not as the person who held all the cards, but as an ordinary customer, just like the ones who had been mistreated before. No longer a leader from above, she would be one of the people. She would walk through the doors as they did, hoping to experience firsthand how much had truly changed since that fateful day. It was a quiet Thursday morning when she stepped into the first branch she would visit. The experience was jarring. For months, she had been at the forefront of transformation, directing the flow of change, enforcing policies, and putting people in charge of implementing the changes she had set in motion. But now, as she stood at the entrance of a branch in downtown New York, she was just another customer. She had deliberately chosen modest clothing, a simple beige sweater, dark jeans, and flat shoes, nothing that would draw attention to her. As she entered, she felt a familiar sense of discomfort. There was something so ordinary, so pedestrian about the experience. She was met with the usual pleasantries, but there was a strange undercurrent of distance in the air. The employees, who once had their focus on the customer service initiatives Veronica had championed, now looked at her with a mix of hesitation and politeness. But something was different. There was no warmth in their eyes, no genuine effort to connect, just the formal smiles that had come to characterize Evergreen Financial. Veronica walked to a teller's window, where a young woman greeted her with a strained smile. Veronica couldn't help but notice the coldness in her greeting, how it didn't quite reach her eyes, and how the words felt rehearsed rather than genuine. As she handed over her ID and requested a simple withdrawal, she felt the unease spread through her. The process seemed mechanical, like an impersonal transaction rather than an exchange between two people. It wasn't long before the teller, a woman named Emily, excused herself and walked over to consult with her colleague. Veronica could hear their low voices as Emily whispered, barely audible, "She doesn't look like she belongs here, does she?" The word stung. The hurt was immediate, and yet, this time, Veronica didn't feel the need to confront it head-on. She had seen this exact behavior play out before. It was a reflection of the same biases she had witnessed in the very branch where she had been humiliated months ago. It was the same ugly truth, only now it felt personal. The change she had hoped for had not yet come to fruition. The efforts of the Equitable Banking Initiative had barely scratched the surface. Veronica stood still, silently watching the scene unfold. The staff had not yet learned the full lesson of respect and fairness. Their words revealed the deep-seated prejudices that hadn't disappeared overnight. They had the appearance of change, but the substance of it, the true cultural shift, was still absent. Emily returned to her station, her face flushed with discomfort as she took Veronica's card and processed a withdrawal. The tension in the air grew heavier, as if everyone in the bank could sense that something wasn't quite right, that this was not how customer service was supposed to feel. Veronica's gaze never wavered, even as the discomfort began to suffocate the space around her. As the transaction was completed, Emily handed over the money with a mechanical smile. "Here you go, ma'am. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Her voice was polite, but the coldness hadn't melted away. Veronica took the money, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. There was no need to say anything more. As Veronica left the branch, she felt a pang of frustration rise within her. The changes she had worked so hard for had not yet fully taken root. She could still feel the sharp edges of the old culture lurking beneath the surface. Evergreen Financial had made promises, but those promises had yet to be lived by the people who worked there, by the staff who continued to view their customers through the lens of preconceived biases. Veronica wasn't angry, not in the way she had been the first time, but she was disappointed. The experience in that branch solidified her resolve. She had known this would be a long road, but now it was clearer than ever. Change had to go deeper. It had to reach beyond the boardroom and beyond the policies. It had to be embedded into every single interaction, in every single branch, in every exchange with every customer. This was not the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. And Veronica Green was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that Evergreen Financial would finally live up to its promise of being a place where every customer, no matter their background or appearance, would be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. One of the key lessons from Veronica Green's story is that real change doesn't just come from policies or decisions made from above, but from small changes in the actions and attitudes of each individual. For those who have lived through many years and faced numerous challenges, this becomes even clearer. Sometimes we have to face difficult issues like discrimination or unfairness, but the important thing is not to give up. Instead, we can start changing from within ourselves in the way we view and treat others, no matter who they are. This story reminds us that even after many years, learning and change are still important. Sometimes a small action, such as understanding and respect, can make a big difference. Life can always be better if we are patient and ready to face challenges in order to build a more equitable community, where everyone is treated with respect and compassion.